I'm here at the Olszany Cemetery in Prague, and right here you see a tombstone and a wooden cross that commemorates the 187 soldiers of the ROA, the Russian Liberation Army, that lie buried here. But wait a minute, these were soldiers that fought on the side of the Nazis, right? Well, not here in Prague, because here in Prague, in the last days of World War II in Europe, the Prague Uprising took place, where the Czech resistance fought against the Germans. And the Czech resistance was supported by the soldiers of the ROA, led by Andrey Vlasov, that switched sides at the last moment. Why did they do this exactly? And how did it all take place? That's what you're going to learn in this video about how the soldiers of the ROA and the Czech resistance fought together against the Germans. So why were Russians actually fighting for the Nazis? Well, I did make an elaborate video on that, so see the end screen for that. The first Russians that helped the Germans during Operation Barbarossa served as Hueys and later as security units. Later, more independent units were set up. The infamous SS-RONA, SS-RONA, which was led by Bronislav Kaminsky, and the most well-known is the ROA, the Russian Liberation Army, that was led by General Vlasov. Vlasov initially served in the Red Army and was captured in March 1942 at the Volkhov front south of Leningrad. While being interned, he wrote a letter to the German leaders in which he proposed the idea of an anti-Bolshevik army, a Russian Liberation Army. Vlasov had its reasons to join the enemy. He, Vlasov, was alienated from a system that traded in lies and deceit, butchered its own people, and threw thousands of soldiers into battles for which they were poorly prepared. Hitler was against it. He did not want Slavic people in his ranks, but other German officers were more sympathetic to Vlasov's idea. In December 1942, Vlasov issued the Smolensk Declaration, in which he urged the Soviet people to rise up against Stalin. He concluded the declaration as follows: "Arise and join the struggle for freedom. Long may peace with honor with Germany prevail." Hitler was immovably against it because he believed that having inferior races, the Slavs, in his ranks, well, it might undermine his plans for the East. But nevertheless, the ROA, the Russian Liberation Army, was born. In February, already existing Huey and security units formations consisting of Russians, Belarusians and Ukrainians were transferred to the ROA. In September 1944, Hitler accepted the Russian Committee. By now, pragmatism had the upper hand, as the Germans were losing the war. In November 1944, Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler promoted Vlasov to full general and gave him control of 45,000 Russian Axis troops. Vlasov created the Russian People's Liberation Committee, the KONR. This happened in German-occupied Prague, where he issued the Prague Manifesto. And the forces of the KONR were named the VS KONR, although they still wore the ROA arm shield, so I'll still refer to them as ROA soldiers. Now, these ROA or KONR troops saw action in the last months of World War II. Some fought at Nuremberg against the Americans. Now, others, they switched sides and joined the Czech resistance against the Germans in Prague. By that time, the Germans already started to mistrust the men of the ROA, and that had to do with what happened near the end of April. ROA General Sergei Bunyachenko was ordered to march to Brno to fight against the advancing Red Army. His men were under-equipped and he knew casualties would be severe. So instead of advancing, he decided to retreat. Eventually, he was caught up by General Schöne, the Nazi hardliner, as well as with Vlasov, and they had a short meeting. Now, after the meeting was over, Vlasov spoke with Bunyachenko, and he said that he basically understood why Bunyachenko had not advanced towards Brno, and he ordered him to operate as he saw fit. Now, Vlasov, he feared that the Germans might launch reprisals against his men. Now the Czech resistance was aware of this, and on the 2nd of May, the men of the ROA were 50 kilometers southwest of Prague. They were approached by officers of the Czech resistance, who asked them to join them in the uprising against the Germans in Prague. Now, at first Bunyahenko was unwilling, but anti-German sentiments were rife among his men. Bunyahenko excused himself and returned with Vlasov, who questioned the Czechs. Then he asked Bunyahenko and his regimental commanders, "So, gentlemen, what are we going to do now?" There was a long silence. Suddenly, Bunyahenko bellowed, "I think we must help our Slavic brothers." Turning to the Czechs, Vlasov said, "We will support your uprising. Go ahead." And so, the so-called Vlasovites joined the Czech resistance and fought the Germans in Prague. There are different theories on why they changed sides. Some believe that it was due to the anti-German sentiments among the ROA men. Others believed they wanted to gain favor with the Allies and the Soviets, as they saw that the side they were on was losing the war. On the 5th of May, they reached the outskirts of Prague, and the following day they fought against the German troops in the city, also against SS troops that were called to the city to put down the revolt. Now that evening there was a meeting between representatives from the Czech resistance and some Americans, and also a representative of the ROA was there. Now the Americans, they were very surprised that there was a soldier in a German uniform in their midst. The Americans said they were not going to liberate Prague. Prague was for the Soviets to take. But they asked the Czech resistance if they needed any assistance. When the meeting was over, the Russian KONR officer went back to his superiors, Vlasov and Bunyahenko, and he explained them that the Americans were not coming. The Soviets were coming, and they knew very well that it would not end up well for them if they were caught by the Soviets. In other words, remaining in the city would lead to the capture by the Red Army. They had to get out of there. By that time, around 300 ROA soldiers had died fighting the Germans in Prague. By the evening of the 7th of May, the ROA soldiers left Prague, although some soldiers kept fighting the Germans and left the evening of the 8th. Now they hope to reach American lines as soon as possible. They also learned that several KONR officers were captured by the Czech resistance, handed over to the Soviets and shot. By the evening of the 9th of May, the 1st Division of the ROA ran into tank detachments of the US 3rd Army. Now, after some negotiations, they were disarmed by the Americans. This happened on the 11th of May. They were in the Schlusselburg region, which is southwest of Prague. The Americans did not permit them to cross American lines. The Soviets were not far. The Soviets even sent some emissaries that wanted to encourage the ROA men to come to their side. An agreement was made to cross the Soviet lines at 12 a.m. on May 12th. They knew very well which fate awaited them if they would go over to the side of the Soviets, but at least it bought them some time. Bunyahenko, he went to the American commander that was stationed in the Schlusselburg Castle, which was the American HQ. Now, the American commander, he understood the situation, but he could not permit the Russians to go over to their side. Also, the Americans would soon evacuate the Czech region altogether. This news was the death blow for the division. The order was given for the men to dismiss and to fend for themselves. An estimated 10,000 KONR men or ROA men fell in Soviet hands right away. Half of the 1st Division managed to reach the American lines, but many of them were captured by the Americans and handed over to the Soviets. The Western Allies had made an agreement with Stalin at Yalta. Former Soviet citizens needed to be repatriated. Neither the British nor the Americans had fully thought through the implications of this agreement. Soviet authorities misled their allies by insisting that their civilians had been forced into German ranks against their will. They would be separated from German prisoners, treated well, and not categorized as prisoners of war. The British and Americans guessed that Stalin wanted revenge on all those Soviet citizens, around 1 million of them, who had served in Wehrmacht uniform or had been forced through starvation to become Hiwis. Bunyachenko and Vlasov remained at the castle, and they both fell in Soviet hands. There are different accounts on what exactly happened. What is clear is that they made it out of the castle and wanted to reach American lines. They ran into a Soviet column. According to Soviet accounts, Vlasov was wrapped in a carpet on the bottom of the jeep. He was brought to Moscow and not heard from again till the 2nd of August 1946. Then it was announced he had been hanged together with 11 others on the orders of the military tribunal of the Supreme Court of the USSR. Now, very little is known about his imprisonment and to what extent he was tortured or not. There is one testimony of a Soviet officer that went to Vlasov to ask him to recant, and if he wouldn't do that, he would be tortured to death. To which Vlasov seemed to have replied, "I know that, and I am very frightened, but it would be even worse to have to vilify myself. But our sufferings will not be in vain. In time, the Russian people will remember us with warmth." Now, to what extent Vlasov was tortured or not is unknown. I mean, even got a trial, although he refused to recant. And the forcibly repatriations, it's a very tragic aftermath of the Second World War, especially because it also applied for white émigrés, people who fled Russia during the Russian Civil War and actually never had been Soviet citizens, although not all were repatriated. Then there was also General Patton, who refused to comply. And of course the very small nation of Liechtenstein that became a safe haven of the First Russian National Army, which was also a Russian collaborationist force. One of the most notorious cases was the forcibly repatriation of 50,000 Cossacks, among which 11,000 women, children and elderly. If you want to learn about Cossack collaboration during World War II, click here, and click here for the video about the Russian Liberation Army. Thank you so much for watching, and best wishes from this cemetery in Prague, Czech Republic.